Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'm going to be interviewing Arna Ghosh. Um, and Arna Ghosh has been a really important person in my life and a really important person supporting me through the Crohn's journey. So today I'm going to sort of just ask questions about him and his experience supporting someone with Crohn's. And this is a very casual, unscripted conversation. So let's just dive right into it. So my first question for you is, you've sort of been part of this Crohn's journey for a while now. And what have you kind of learned about Crohn's um, as you look back? And if you could talk a little bit about like what you already might have known about Crohn's and then how you sort of got to know a little bit more about it and then where you are now. I think that would be really interesting from a caregiver perspective.
Yeah, I think before I met you or I got to know about Crohn's from you, I didn't know much about Crohn's. I'd heard of it and I knew that it was an autoimmune disorder, but I I didn't know what it entailed on the person going through, as well as like the people around them. But it was more like I think again, it was more from a biology perspective that I knew a bit about like, oh, there's this disease, disorder, and these are like it's an autoimmune disorder. So I think most of my knowledge about Crohn's does come from you, like from hearing about it from you, or like you telling me about specific things. So in some sense, yeah, it's been an educational experience. But also I think yeah, like the first thing, for instance, I remember you told me is that you don't have a large intestine. So I think that is, let's say, my introduction to Crohn's almost. That, oh, this is kind of like one of the as in like this is what it does, like it entails, like going through Crohn's. Um, and yeah, I mean, again, like it's been a big educational experience in terms of like knowing what it actually is, how complicated is the diagnosis, or like the symptoms and what the experience is. Because a lot of the disorders that we generally hear about, like we read about them or we get to know about them, it's presented to us in a very almost like a problem solution kind of system that, oh, this person or this disease happens because of XYZ, but we don't really get to see the healthcare side of it. So we get to see more of the medicine side of it, or we get to hear about the medicine side of it. And I think just the amount of like effort that it takes both from the healthcare professionals as well as from the patient side to kind of go through different tests, different wait for the different results, that how it's less of a problem solution kind of a thing, more kind of a discussion process that you go through the entire thing. And every time, like any symptom that appears, you have to go through the entire process all over again, maybe with an added context almost about that, oh, this has happened before, there is this additional condition. So it's there on the paper, but to actually get to the final even diagnosis or the solution into like how do you actually manage some symptoms or some issues, I think it's a complete, like it's not a very objective process, it's a very subjective process. And I think that's one thing that again, like I think it's part of growing up, you get to see more people going through their own life, their own issues, and you get to realize how subjective the entire diagnosis healthcare process is. I think Crohn's is no exception. If anything, Crohn's is a good case study for that, because it is so complicated. And not a lot of like, it's not like every family physician has the know-how or capabilities to deal with the extent of the different symptoms. And some of the symptoms are just like, they're not necessarily Crohn's or because of Crohn's, but they're aggravated because of Crohn's. So something that might be easy to solve or might be like a go-to solution in a lot of cases might get much more complicated, but much more of a monster to deal with because of Crohn's.
Yeah, so I have two follow-up questions based on what you said. The first one is, you said you already knew about Crohn's beforehand, which I find really interesting because I think especially in like sort of the South Asian community, it's really not a well-known disease. So I'm actually curious, like how did you even hear? Because I never knew about its existence until I was diagnosed, actually with ulcerative colitis and then Crohn's. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, yeah, I think it's more like I heard of it under like a laundry list of like, oh, autoimmune disorders, like where your immune system is not, I don't know, being a good player. So I think it's because maybe because I remember rheumatoid arthritis is part of the laundry list as well, and I think arthritis is pretty common among South Asians. So maybe that's potentially why I got to hear about Crohn's, but yeah, I don't know anybody else who's suffering from it. And even I think colitis definitely I had not heard of. I'd heard of Crohn's. So I think when you say Crohn's and colitis, I think it's a bit more like, oh, okay, I've heard part of it.
Mm,
I've not heard of colitis before.
yeah. And we don't like to use the word suffering in the chronically ill community, but okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. But my second question for that was like, now that you know what you know, and suppose you met somebody who'd never heard of Crohn's before, um, and they were like, "Oh, I'm being diagnosed," or a family member is being diagnosed with Crohn's. What would you say to them when if they're trying to ask you, like, do you know anything about Crohn's? What do you know about Crohn's? What would you say to them? Just briefly.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think just the the experience or just the disease in itself, like what it entails specifically, like it's an autoimmune disorder. So kind of trying to explain or talk about that, but again, it depends on what is the conversation, what is the context of the conversation, especially if the other person is kind of trying to wrap their head around this concept. I think that's a different conversation versus if the person is kind of sharing that this is what they're going through. I think that's a different conversation. I think in the first case, like obviously yeah, you get to discuss or you tell them about like, well, it's an autoimmune disorder, like what potential symptoms with like the digestive tract and like how, I mean, obviously, like your reference point is obviously useful because then I can say that, look, my knowledge is not textbook knowledge. I know because I know someone who's gone through the process. But on the other, like in the second conversation where they know that it's an autoimmune disorder. Again, there's no point in like preaching to the choir in that case. And I think the more important conversation then is to kind of let them know that they're not the only person going through this. And sometimes like it's important to even tell that, even if it is obvious, they know at the back of their head, like they're not the first person to be diagnosed with Crohn's. But also I think another important bit is it's not like fever, it's not like other diseases that, oh, I'm taking medicine, I'll be fine. It's something that you learn to live with. And the only thing is like, yeah, it's kind of like life. There'll be ups, there'll be lows, there'll be highs, there'll be lows. Uh, when you're at a low, when you're not feeling as well, I think the only thing, again, like it's not ideal to say that, oh, when I'm actually going to get back to the high point, the only thing you can do is like, am I doing better than yesterday? If not, what can I do? So I think the only comparison point becomes like a very close time point when you can be like, oh, well, I'm actually feeling better than yesterday. I did XYZ and I'm actually feeling better. Sometimes even like you did XYZ, you repeat that, you kind of like get involved in it almost like a habit of like, this helped me feel better. It could still lead to you feeling worse because there's so many factors going on. But I think a lot of the times that I feel like a lot of people do because it's just a genuine habit that we feel with. But when we deal with illness, we always try to think that when I'm going to be back to normal again. But I think it's something to kind of like always keep in mind that what is normal for someone else may not be normal for me. Even if like what was normal for me, I don't know, 5 years back is not normal for me anymore. I think normal for me is changing, and it's more like a relative concept. It's not an absolute concept anymore. And I think that's important to remember because it's easy to forget something like that because I think again the concept of normal is so normalized in society.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. It's a very much a dynamic equilibrium, and the set point changes a lot over time. So sort of in relation to that, and you might have already sort of said it, but what, in your opinion, is the most sort of challenging thing about not just about Crohn's, but supporting somebody with Crohn's, because that's a very different. I think in some ways it's easier when you yourself are going through a difficult time because you know what's happening inside of you. Whereas if you're trying to support a loved one who's going through a difficult time, that becomes its own sort of challenge. So yeah, what do you think is sort of this a really challenging aspect of
Um, yeah, I think I think being patient, because like you said, you're not going through it. So it's hard to kind of do certain things to kind of like that have an immediate impact. You and it's also easy to kind of uh, you know, be the armchair theorist and be like, oh, you have to do this, and things might look better because you don't have enough skin in the game. You're neither the person who's taking the actions nor the person who's actually dealing with the symptoms directly. So all you can do is, I don't know, trust the person who's going through the symptoms alone. So trust their judgment. You can obviously like, you know, give your own opinions about stuff, but it has to be presented more like a discussion, because you cannot like again, you can come off as an armchair theorist, and that is not helpful to anyone. um I think the other thing is like, again, when I say being patient, it's more like through the entire discussion with the healthcare professionals, it's easy to kind of be like, why don't we have a solution? This has been so long. But I think that's just how complicated things are, no matter how they are, you know, advertised in I don't know, mass media or like general society. That I think a lot of the autoimmune disorders in general are not very well understood. There's still a lot of work going on, and healthcare is something that is a much more dynamic thing, that is and very personalized. Like each individual has to have their own kind of strategy developed, that is catered to them, that is more suitable for them. So it's also harder to transfer knowledge from one case to another. Like even if I meet somebody else, I again, I hope but I would have to remind myself to be careful to not to kind of overgeneralize and say that, oh, these things work for somebody else I know should be working for you. No, is hardly the case in complicated disorders such as Crohn's, but also like other autoimmune disorders, which again, like as a society, we have normalized that a disease is kind of this objective thing, that or a disorder is kind of this objective thing, that the same strategies will work for the disorder, no matter who the individual is. So I think respecting the individual, their own preferences, being patient through the process. I think, yeah, these are the challenges, because it's, again, like when you see a loved one going through that, uh, you obviously want them to get better, fitter as soon as possible, but you have to respect the wills of time and just biology in general.
yeah, there's definitely a push towards personalized medicine, but it's slow and like you said, it is a complicated disease. So it's not um yeah, there's no quick answer and there's no quick turnaround. But yes, thank you for your continued patience. Uh okay, so for the interest of time, I'm gonna ask you one last question and then we can wrap it up. So my last question to you is, you know, a lot of people get diagnosed with Crohn's, colitis, and inflammatory bowel disease quite when they're quite young, as young adults. And there's a lot of worry about dating and relationships. So what, you know, given all of your experience, what advice would you give young people in that situation? Maybe not even from a patient's perspective, but again, from somebody on the other side who's like, you know, having to deal with someone who has, that sounds mean, but you know what I mean, having to connect with someone who has Crohn's and colitis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have dating advice specifically for anyone.
Dating
But
and relationship.
yeah, sure. Either I don't know if I have good advice for anyone, be it like whether they're having to deal with Crohn's or whether they're actually you know, involved with someone who's going through the same. I think yeah, the only thing I would say is uh, like when you're navigating, I mean, it's a complicated problem in itself. So having this additional factor kind of complicates the problem by like by many magnitudes. But again, like the good thing about complicated problems is that if it adds more complexities, it's still a complex problem. So you're kind of left at the whims of nature almost. That okay, if something works out, it works out. It's so I think, yeah, like but the core rules remain the same. You get involved with someone who you're having a good time with, whose values match with yours. You can have a good conversation, and in some sense, your goals are aligned. So sure, at some time, I mean, some like it's possible that people go in with this idea of like this is the person I would like to be with. Um, but it's there's a lot of factors that go into like if you meet that person, and I don't think it's fair to kind of compare people to your ideal notion of a person, because everybody's different. So I think it's more like you treat every person with the same, like you respect every person at the end of the day. That's kind of the idea, that you respect every person. You expect respect from them. There should be a mutual respect, but you kind of like try to see them for the person they are, with their pros and cons. And when I say cons, it's not like objective cons or pros, objective pros, but with respect to your values, that good time you're having conversations, and shared goals. And every person will have certain pros and cons. I mean, for sure you have some pros and cons. It's not that you're going in as like, oh, this is the ideal person. Um, so I think it's more like, well, and again, the rules are the same, that do you like the pros enough? Can you handle the cons enough? And uh, can you navigate them? And I think it gets easier if you can have those conversations. If you can have conversations, it gets easier if you have shared goals, if you have shared values, it's easier to deal with them. Um, so yeah, I sure things are different, but that's how it is. Like I wouldn't necessarily put it as like extra difficulty. I think it's a different axis altogether. So if somebody is like for somebody who's going through Crohn's, getting into the dating atmosphere or relationships, I think it comes down to like, are you with a person who is uh, kind of willing to be patient and handle and work. Like in relationships, it's a bit easier because then it's like you are a team already. So is it more like, well, you're treating each problem, or you're dealing with each problem as a team? I think in dating it gets a bit harder because you're looking for that teammate. So so I think you still don't know if the person is willing to be in the same team as you. But like any other team, when you join, there are certain things that the team is providing you. So there's certain things you offer to the team so that the team works. So again, like it's just a different attribute. It's an additional
Yay,
attribute.
sports.
So yeah, it's an additional attribute that gets added on, and something that again, I think different people might treat differently or might approach it differently. Uh, I feel it's always better to have an open line of communication, so it's not something that gets sprung up later on. Um, but that's just my
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people who have Crohn's and colitis, they're worried about, being too much, too soon, too fast.
Mm,
And I think you're right in that you do eventually have to communicate, but
mm,
everybody has a different pace of doing that,
mm,
what they're willing to share, what they're willing to get feedback on. Um, so yeah, some great points. Okay, well, thank you for your insight. I will stop recording now, and I hope that people listening will get something out of this that they can apply to their own relationships with each other and to people who have Crohn's and colitis.